Okay. I prostrate to the Arya triple gem. Thus did I hear at one time. The Bhagawan was dwelling on Massa Vulture's mountain in Rajagriha, together with a great community of monks and a great community of bodhisattvas. At that time, the Bhagawan was absorbed in the concentration on the categories of phenomena called profound perception. Also at that time, the Bodhisattva, Mahasattva, Arya, Avalokiteshvara looked upon the very practice of the profound perfection of wisdom and beheld those five aggregates also as empty of inherent nature. Then, through the power of Buddha, the Venerable Shariputra said this to the Bodhisattva, Mahasattva, Arya Avalokiteshvara: how should any son of the lineage train who wishes to practice the activity of the profound perfection of wisdom? He said that, and the Bodhisattva, Mahasattva, Arya Avalokiteshvara said this to the Venerable Sharadvatiputra: Shariputra, any son of the lineage or daughter of the lineage who wishes to practice the activity of the profound perfection of wisdom should look upon it like this, correctly and repeatedly, beholding those five aggregates also as empty of inherent nature. Form is empty. Emptiness is form. Emptiness is not other than form. Form is also not other than emptiness. In the same way, feeling, discrimination, compositional factors, and consciousness are empty. Shariputra, likewise, all phenomena are emptiness, without characteristic, unproduced, unceased, stainless, not without stain, not deficient, not fulfilled. Shariputra, therefore, in emptiness there is no form, no feeling, no discrimination, no compositional factors, no consciousness, no eye, no ear, no nose, no tongue, no body, no mind, no visual form, no sound, no odor, no taste, no object of touch, and no phenomenon. There is no I element, and so on up to and including, no mind element, and no mental consciousness element. There is no ignorance, no extinction of ignorance, and so on up to and including, no aging and death, and no extinction of aging and death. Similarly, there is no suffering, origination, cessation, and path. There is no exalted wisdom, no attainment, and also no non-attainment. Shariputra, therefore, because there is no attainment, bodhisattvas rely on and dwell in the perfection of wisdom, the mind without obscuration and without fear. Having completely passed beyond error, they reach the end point of nirvana. All the Buddhas who dwell in the three times also manifestly completely awaken to unsurpassable, perfect, complete enlightenment in reliance on the perfection of wisdom. Therefore, the mantra of the perfection of wisdom, the mantra of great knowledge, the unsurpassed mantra, the mantra equal to the unequaled, the mantra that thoroughly pacifies all suffering, should be known as truth, since it is not false. The mantra of the perfection of wisdom is declared, Tayata Om Gate, Gate, Para Gate, Para Samgate, Bodhi Swaha. Shariputra, the Bodhisattva, Mahasattva, should train in the profound perfection of wisdom like that. Then the Bhagawan arose from that concentration and commended the Bodhisattva, Mahasattva, Arya, Avalokiteshvara, saying, well said, son of the lineage. It is like that. It is like that. One should practice the profound perfection of wisdom, just as you have indicated. Even the Tathagatas rejoice. The Bhagawan having thus spoken, the Venerable Sharadvatiputra, the Bodhisattva, Mahasattva, Arya, Avalokiteshvara, and those surrounding in their entirety, along with the world of gods, humans, asuras, and Gandharvas, were overjoyed and highly praised that spoken by the Bhagawan. We'll do the short mandala offering. This ground, anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, 4 continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryata Yami. And then finally, refuge in bodhicitta. We'll do this once in English, twice in Tibetan, bringing to mind these two thoughts of having that heartfelt sense of confidence in the three jewels and their ability to protect us from all suffering. And then also cultivating the mind of bodhicitta, thinking that we're here in order to create the causes for our own enlightenment so we can help all beings. And we'll meditate on this mind as well shortly. But let's go ahead and recite that now. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi daki chanyen gipe sunam gi Dola Penshir Sangye Drupar Shok Sangye Chodang Soki Choknam La Jangchu Bardu Dakni Kyabsu Chi Daki Chanyen Gipe Sanam Gi Dola Penshir Sangye Drupar Shok. Okay, thank you, John. As usual, we'll do a short meditation before we begin. Just give ourselves a chance to focus our minds a bit. Again, generally, it's good just to use the breath as your meditation object, trying to stay present with it as best as you can. Whenever the mind wanders, guide the mind back to the breath. And then after a few minutes of silent meditation, I'll lead you in a short reflection to set our bodhicitta motivation for tonight. So I'll ring the bell to begin. So now let's set our motivation for tonight. And I thought we would do this since the topic of the Four Noble Truths is coming up in tonight's class by just reviewing them briefly in terms of channeling an awareness of them into our motivation. And recall that they're initially taught in the Lam Rem as a way of understanding our own situation. So let's begin there by, first of all, acknowledging that first noble truth that is to be understood, which is this truth of suffering or dukkha, this unsatisfactory state that we find ourselves in, having to experience this dissatisfaction that is the undercurrent of our lives. Even when we find something that is pleasant and happy, it simply doesn't last and doesn't fulfill our deepest expectations. And that's because we are under the control of our karma and delusions. In this state of existence, we're really never free for even a moment from some level of dissatisfaction. And then secondly, the truth of the causes of dukkha, of suffering. That it is those delusions, especially the root of ignorance, as well as all the karma we create, that keeps us bound in this pattern, keeps us going from life to life. The problems are not in the external world, they're in our own minds. The states of mind that we've created since beginningless time that have never seen things correctly. And then again, the actions we engage in on the basis of those delusions. So again, recall that these are true for yourself, these first two truths. This is the state that you are in right now. And then to reflect on the fact that the Buddha went on in the third and fourth truths to teach the possibility of there being something better, something that's not just a bit better, but is radically better. The third truth, that is the truth of the cessation of dukkha, of suffering, that it can be ended once and for all the causes of it completely uprooted. This is the path the Buddha himself found, and that we're learning in terms of the mechanics of that, how we move to having direct realization of emptiness and eventually removing everything that obscures our minds so we can know true freedom, liberation, as well as even attain enlightenment. So recall that this is a possibility for you. You can have that true cessation. And how do you achieve it? Through the true path, through all the things that we learn in the Lam Rim studies that will help us to progress and advance to that state where we have completely removed all the causes of our own suffering and moreover attain the state of enlightenment. So first of all, with the confidence that you can achieve that state, be united with an understanding of how other sentient beings are in the same predicament. All those beings in samsara dealing with the first truth, the truth of dukkha, having unsatisfactory lives. The second truth, that arising through the force of their own karma and delusions. And moreover, the third truth, that they have the possibility as well to have an end once and for all to all their suffering, all their dissatisfaction, and to achieve every happiness that they seek. And therefore, they have to practice the path, the fourth noble truth. And this is where we generate that motivation of bodhicitta, because we want sentient beings to attain that state. We want them to be free from suffering and to attain complete enlightenment. We want to be able to teach them the path that will lead to that result. So therefore, we cultivate the mind of bodhicitta that aspires to perfect our own minds so we can then teach others perfectly, help them on their path, help them to achieve exactly what they desire. In this way, our studies of these grounds and paths will become very meaningful because we're doing it with the intention of helping all of these beings to know the path that will lead to their liberation and enlightenment. So hold that motivation of bodhicitta very deeply in your heart for tonight, so everything we do becomes a cause for that result. Okay. So again, we are working our way through the 5 paths, and we're beginning to look at the grounds tonight, because the first ground begins with the path of seeing that we started last week. We began our exploration of the path of seeing. We didn't go through much of the text. It was mostly going through some of the slides that show how the path of seeing is set out in terms of that initial direct realization of emptiness that occurs there. So again, we were right on the cusp of looking at this whole idea of what actually happens in that moment of what's called the uninterrupted path. Again, I did all of this terminology at the beginning of last week's class. Hopefully you were here or you had a chance to listen to that. But essentially there are 2 parts to what is called a meditative equipoise. And anytime we have a meditative equipoise, it's a realization of emptiness. And when it has the particular power to remove some level of the afflictive obstructions or the knowledge obstructions, then we have the uninterrupted path that acts as an antidote to that, and then the liberated path that occurs immediately after, when there is that complete cessation of whatever level of the obscurations we removed. So let's go ahead and pull up the slides, and I'll kind of get us grounded back in where we were. I'm going to repeat a few slides from last week. I forgot to set it up to go right to the one that says slideshow. Okay, here we go. Slideshow from the current slide. Okay, so again, just to get us grounded in the overall outline of the text, remember that this was kind of within the 2 parts of this section of the text. You had first the Hinayana, or the fundamental vehicle grounds and paths. Now we're looking at the Mahayana. We didn't really go through the Hinayana because we're mostly focusing in this course on the Mahayana, the Bodhisattvas grounds and paths. And so we went through the definitions of those quite some time ago, into the divisions, which were the causal grounds and the resultant grounds. The causal grounds consists of those of the common beings, those of the superiors. The superiors are those who have directly realized emptiness. And so that's actually the section that we're in now. And then when we finish that, we'll go on to the result grounds, which are the Mahayana path of no more learning, when the Bodhisattva becomes a Buddha. So again, we already went through that of the common beings, which were the first 2 paths, the paths of accumulation and preparation. Now we are in the grounds of Bodhisattva superiors. Last week, we first started off with the definitions of those, what is a ground of a Bodhisattva superior, and so on. I won't be repeating that. Instead, we're going into the divisions. The divisions are twofold, which are the Mahayana paths of seeing, which is where we are now, and then the Mahayana paths of meditation, which we'll hopefully get into a little bit later tonight. So in terms of the paths of seeing, we already looked at the definitions for it and what have you, but I'm going to jump in again a few slides before where we ended last week. So again, the meditative equipoise of the path of seeing is divided into 2 parts, as I mentioned earlier: an uninterrupted path that abandons the artificial afflictions. Again, artificial is Jeffrey Hopkins' word for what I usually call the intellectually acquired. These are the level of the afflictive obstructions that we acquire in this life through wrong tenets, various philosophical things that influence our thinking about things, and they reinforce the innate the innate afflictions, or the innate afflictive obstructions, which are those that are with us since beginningless time. They're inborn, is what's meant by innate. And then there is the path of release, that is the state of having abandoned those artificial afflictions. So again, at the path of seeing, all we are getting rid of, it's a big chunk, but all we're getting rid of is those that are acquired in this life. We haven't even touched the innate in terms of those that we have from prior lives that we've had since beginningless time. So this is what's happening in the first part of the path of seeing. You enter into any ground by virtue of a meditative equipoise. And the meditative equipoise, again, has that first part, the uninterrupted path, that is the actual antidote. And then the path of release, which they say is like having thrown out the thief in the first part of it, you now close the door. You now keep that from ever recurring again. It's the state of having completely, fully abandoned whatever level of afflictions are going on. And in this case, for the path of seeing, it's just the artificial afflictions. An uninterrupted path is so named because without interruption or interval, a yogi will pass on to a path of release. That is a condition of having been released from these afflictions. So the uninterrupted path of a path of seeing corresponds and this is where we left off last week, to the 8 forbearances, and the path of release corresponds to what are called the 8 knowledges. So the reason why I'm bringing these up, it's not mentioned so much in our text. We'll go to our text a little bit later and we'll see that it is referred to, but there's not really much explanation of it. But I think it is important that we understand what these are, these 8 forbearances and 8 knowledges that occur on the uninterrupted path and the path of release for the path of seeing, respectively. So during the 8 forbearances, these first set of 8, the realization of the lack of inherent existence is applied to objects and subjects. Remember how even on the path of preparation, we were looking at objects and subjects, subjective awarenesses, as well as the objects that they are realizing. And, in particular, it's applied to the Four Noble Truths, which are the first of these 8. They're divided into 2 parts. There's the Dharma Forbearances and then the subsequent forbearances. The 4 Dharma Forbearances are the Four Noble Truths, exactly as I laid them out in our meditation tonight. True suffering, true origins or causes, true cessations, and true paths. So what we're realizing is the lack of inherent existence with regard to those 4 objects, which are objects of knowledge. In fact, we call them the Four Noble Truths because they are seen for what they are in their truth by those who are noble, or Aryas, superiors. The word noble is a translation of the word Arya. Sometimes it's translated again as superior. But this is what is being realized, in a sense, on the path of seeing, is the Four Noble Truths themselves lacking inherent existence, and the subjects that realize the absence of inherent existence with respect to those Four Noble Truths are the 4 subsequent forbearances. By forbearances, we're going to see this in a moment. I'll share some slides from Geshe Jampa Tekchok, his commentary on Salam, on grounds and paths. But forbearances means that you're sort of able to endure getting to the emptiness of those things, seeing the emptiness of those things, having that appear very vividly to you. Recall that on the path of seeing, you're having your initial direct realization of emptiness, and in a sense, you are then realizing the emptiness of all phenomena, even though you weren't necessarily looking at all phenomena as the observed object. And when you were trying to discern emptiness, you are realizing the emptiness that is the quality that is ascribed to every single thing that exists. So in this way, you are realizing here the objects of the Four Noble Truths and the subjective awarenesses that realize them. So I did find a little, and I can even send these on. They can be posted. They're essentially though teachings from Salam that was done in Singapore, I believe, and they are part of some notes from some classes. I think that's where they're from. If they're not Singapore, then they're Malaysia. But I think it was when Salam was being taught from the Svatantrika Madhyamaka point of view. But the chart is the same in terms of these. So here we're looking at the forbearances that are on the uninterrupted path, as it says in the upper left-hand corner. So we see the focal object of each of these. The first 4 are all Dharma forbearances. The first, second, third, and fourth, they are in relation to the 4 truths. That's their focal object. The truths of suffering, origin, cessation, and path. And what is being realized about them, because again, the focal object, the sufferings aren't appearing to that mind. The only thing that is appearing to that mind is emptiness. But in relation to the truths of suffering, we're realizing the emptiness of the truths of suffering. Because again, that mind in meditative equipoise and emptiness is realizing the emptiness of all phenomena. Now again, the Four Noble Truths are an important object of meditation for the Bodhisattva as well as for those on the Hinayana paths. And it's not in all schools that these are taught in terms of them arising at the same time. But in this tradition, all of these 4, as well as the next 4, the subsequent forbearances, arise simultaneously because the Bodhisattva is in that meditative equipoise on emptiness in the uninterrupted path and is thereby realizing the emptiness of all phenomena. So again, there's no great mystery to this chart. It's just setting out the 4 Noble Truths as the focal objects. And then you're having these 4 Dharma forbearances because you are realizing the Dharma of those. You are realizing the true nature of those, the sphere of existence of those, which is their emptiness. The next four start with the first subsequent forbearance. Now, again, they're called subsequent because in those lower systems, you do realize these sequentially. First, you would have the Dharma Forbearances in the order of those four, and then you would go on to realize the subsequent forbearances. They are the awarenesses, again, of the subjective awarenesses emptiness. So these are the realization of emptiness of the subjective awareness that is realizing the emptiness of the truth of suffering, for example. So if we look at that first one, it's called the first subsequent forbearance. What is its focal object? Its focal object is the first Dharma forbearance, which is the awareness of emptiness in relation to true sufferings, the uninterrupted path that directly realizes the emptiness of the truths of suffering. And what it is realizing is the emptiness of that. It's realizing that that subjective awareness is also empty of inherent existence. Because once more, it's realizing the emptiness of all phenomena. With regard to the second subsequent forbearance, its focal object is the second Dharma forbearance, which is up above the realization of the emptiness of truths of origins, true origins or true causes of our suffering. So it is realizing the emptiness of that second Dharma forbearance, and it's called a second subsequent forbearance because it's based on the subjective awareness of that. So again, I don't know if I need to explain it much further, but this is essentially what is happening on the uninterrupted path. All 8 of these are occurring simultaneously, according to Prasangika Madhyamaka, because we're realizing the far right column, the emptiness of all of these at the same time, the emptiness of all the objects of observation that are the Four Noble Truths, the emptiness of all of the subjective awarenesses that are realizing the emptiness of the Four Noble Truths. So again, the Four Noble Truths, as I said, is a very important object of meditation. And it's actually said that many bodhisattvas will meditate on the Four Noble Truths as part of their training on the path of preparation as well, to realize the emptiness of these, so that, again, they're quite familiar with the emptiness meditations and analyses that they've done on the path of preparation, because that's what the path of preparation is all about, right? As we saw when we went through that. Okay, so Jeffrey Hopkins continues. He says, through direct realization of the emptinesses that qualify these objects, objects and subjects, again, but they're all objects then, the Four Noble Truths that are realized to be empty of inherent existence, and then the 4 subjective awarenesses that are realizing the emptiness of those are also empty of inherent existence. By way of that, artificial conceptions of inherent existence with respect to the Four Noble Truths are simultaneously abandoned. Okay, so actually, maybe this is just the object. Sorry, I think he goes into the subjects on the next slide. So you are realizing that the Four Noble Truths are empty, so you're realizing the emptiness of those and abandoning any artificial conceptions you have regarding the inherent existence of those Four Noble Truths. Those are all being abandoned simultaneous to that realization. In other words, the initial direct realization of emptiness causes the artificial conceptions, again, these intellectually acquired conceptions that we have from this life, of inherent existence to be abandoned simultaneously with respect to 1, true sufferings, such as an afflicted being wandering in cyclic existence, that's a true suffering. 2, true origins, such as a conception of true existence itself, which is the ignorance that is a part of the delusions that are the causes of our suffering. 3, true cessations, such as the absence of an affliction brought about by cultivation of its antidote, which is what we're cultivating on these paths, these superior paths. And true paths, such as a realization of emptiness. In other words, you're realizing the emptiness of all 4 of those and everything that's included in there, not just these examples, but everything that would be included in those categories of the afflicted phenomena that are the first 2 truths, and the purified phenomena that are the other 2 truths, the true paths and the true cessations. And then he goes on to talk about the subjective thing. So yes, he says the emptiness of the wisdom consciousness, cognizing these, is also realized at the same time. This realization is nevertheless called subsequent, as I mentioned earlier, because in the lower systems of tenets, there is a step-by-step procedure, even though in this system, again, Prasangika Madhyamaka that we're studying here, An actual temporal sequence does not occur. They all occur simultaneous. So even the word subsequent is used with regard to the realization of the emptiness of these subjective awarenesses, these wisdom consciousnesses realizing the emptiness of the Four Noble Truths. They are all happening simultaneously, all happening at the same moment, and the artificial conceptions with regard to both of them are being removed, eliminated, ceased. Okay, so then looking a little bit more at these 8 forbearances, in the first moment of the path of seeing, this is from Geshe Jampe Tekchok's commentary, the Dharma or Dharmic forbearance of true suffering directly understands the reality, the emptiness of true sufferings. Such an understanding has never before arisen in the mind of this Bodhisattva. As we saw previously, that mind, the object possessor, and emptiness of true suffering, the object, become oneness, like water mixed with water, and the Bodhisattva is able to forbear true sufferings without fear. So this is the idea of it being a forbearance, is that you're able to forbear the reality of true sufferings without any fear. Kind of, because you're with their emptiness, seeing the lack of any inherent existence of those true sufferings. At the same time, the emptiness of true origins is realized. And so the same mind is called Dharmic forbearance of true origins. That was the second one on our chart, right? Similarly, the emptiness of true cessations and of the true path is realized. And so the same mind is called Dharmic forbearance of true cessation and Dharmic forbearance of the true path. That's the first 4 that we saw on our chart that I had up there earlier. So again, it's just realizing the emptiness of these objects, each of the 4 Noble Truths. The 4 subsequent forbearances occur together as well, and at the same time as the 4 Dharmic forbearances. The Dharmic forbearances of the 4 Noble Truths are the direct realizations of the emptinesses of the 4 Noble Truths, right? That's the first 4. The Dharmic forbearances, they are the realizations of the emptiness of those 4 objects, the 4 Noble Truths. At the same time that they occur, the mind indirectly realizes itself. It's not that the mind becomes an object, direct object of perception, because the only thing that's appearing to that meditative equipoise is emptiness, right? In the uninterrupted path. So the mind, has through that indirect realization, realizes the emptinesses of the minds, realizing the emptinesses of the 4 Noble Truths. And those are the 4 subsequent forbearances. So it gets a little tricky wording wise, but essentially what you have is a subjective awareness that's realizing the emptiness of the 4 Noble Truths. We're realizing the emptiness of that subjective awareness. That the subjective awareness that's realizing emptiness doesn't have any inherent existence either. Okay, those were the other 4 and the subsequent forbearances. So then Geshe Jampa Tekchok goes on to say, the Dharmic forbearance of true suffering is so called because it realizes the emptiness of true suffering and can endure the realization of this fact, similar to what he said a few slides ago. The subsequent forbearance of true suffering is so called because this same mind realizes the emptiness of itself, the Dharmic forbearance of true suffering, and is able to endure the realization of this fact. So it's not just enduring the realization of the emptiness of the true sufferings, but also the emptiness, it's enduring the realization of the emptiness of the awareness, knowing the emptiness of true suffering. So again, it's a kind of another layer on top of it, but it's because we have to remove any misconceptions with relation to both objects and subjects, the objects that are the 4 Noble Truths, and then the subjective awarenesses that are realizing the emptiness of those 4. And again, the same can be said for each of the 4 Noble Truths, because that was just about sufferings, origins, cessations, and paths. The Dharmic forbearance of true origins is so called because it realizes the emptiness of true origins. The subsequent forbearance of true origins would be essentially realizing the emptiness of the wisdom consciousness, realizing the emptiness of true origins. Again, so you have those 2 layers of subject, starting first with the object and then the subjective awareness knowing that object. But again, they're all realized simultaneously. Pretty amazing, pretty powerful mind. So then he goes on to say, we say Dharmic forbearance because the mind directly realizes the Dharma nature, the Dharma Dhatu, the sphere of reality of the 4 Noble Truths. And we say subsequent forbearance because, although its direct object is always emptiness, the same mind indirectly realizes itself, the Dharmic forbearance. Thus, all 8 forbearances occur at the same time. So he doesn't give quite the same explanation as subsequent, but again, subsequent is the name that we use for it, particularly in the lower systems that say they follow sequentially. But in this case, you could say, I mean, there is the realization of the emptiness of the Four Noble Truths, and then it would seem that subsequent to that, one would realize the emptiness of that awareness, realizing the emptiness of the Four Noble Truths, because it would seem like you'd have to have some sort of causal process involved in that. But nonetheless, in Prasangika Madhyamaka, they say that the Bodhisattva is realizing the emptiness of all of these, because the Bodhisattva is realizing the emptiness of all phenomena on the path of seeing. Okay. The 8 forbearances only occur during the uninterrupted path of the path of seeing, when one is in the process of abandoning, again, he called them here the intellectual conceptions of true existence or intellectual afflictive obstructions. We could say intellectually acquired, or again, as Jeffrey Hopkins did, artificial. Those are all abandoned. They have the antidote to them on the uninterrupted path. That first part of the meditative equipoise, when the Bodhisattva goes into the direct realization of emptiness of all phenomena, and the antidote is generated to these artificial or intellectual conceptions. Okay, now the 8 knowledges, these are happening with the liberated path or the path of release. So this is the knowledge that those artificial conceptions of inherent existence have been abandoned. We talked about this a little bit last week, right? They do say that to the mind of that bodhisattva and meditative equipoise on the liberated path, there is this knowledge of the complete cessation of that level of the obstructions that are abandoned with regard to that uninterrupted path that was generated. And this is on the path of release. The path of release is once more where the door is shut so that the thief won't return. The cessation is actually complete at that point. There is no longer, those things are no longer in the mind, and it's a true cessation in that they will never recur again. You will never have an artificial conception of inherent existence or intellectually acquired afflictive obstructions in the mind again. They've been completely removed. So let's look at, I mean, again, the chart isn't going to tell us a whole lot more because the chart looks very much like the other chart. It's just different in the upper left-hand corner. So you'll see, I'll just change it right now to that chart. These are the knowledges, the 8 knowledges, which occur on the path of release. And again, you had your first Dharma knowledge related to the truth of suffering, and the emptiness of the truth of suffering is what it too is still realizing. On the liberated path, even though again you do have some, or path of release, you do have some awareness of that cessation, it's still realizing emptiness. Both, if it is a meditative equipoise, it is realizing emptiness. And the only 2 parts of the meditative equipoise are the uninterrupted path and the liberated path, the path of release. So both of those are realizing emptiness directly. So again, the only thing that's really changed is that first column. And of course, the knowledge in the last 4 of the column, the 2 columns, second and third column for the last 4, because again, you're realizing the emptiness of the first Dharma knowledge in the first subsequent knowledge. You're realizing the emptiness of the second Dharma knowledge in the second subsequent knowledge, and so on. But it's the same kind of schema, again, that you are realizing at that time both the emptiness of the objects, the Four Noble Truths, as well as the emptiness of the consciousness realizing those objects, or realizing the emptiness of those objects. Okay. So let's go back to the slides. Sorry, there's a lot of words tonight. I hope I'm using them all trying to use them very carefully so that the meaning is clear. I'm sorry if I get off track here or there. I'll try to stay on track as best as I can with this explanation. So let's talk a little bit more about the 8 knowledges, what Geshe Jumpa Tekchok has to say about them. He says the results of the 8 forbearances on the uninterrupted path are the 8 knowledges, which again are on the liberated path. These give 8 names to the liberated path of the path of seeing, the Dharmic and the subsequent knowledges of each of the Four Noble Truths. The Dharmic knowledge of true suffering, the first of those 8, is so called because at the causal time, the Dharmic forbearance of true suffering abandons the afflictions in relation to true suffering. So in the previous moment before this, you had the Dharmic Forbearance that was knowing the emptiness of true suffering. And so it was abandoning those intellectually acquired afflictive obstructions in relation to true suffering, as we saw earlier. On the completion of that action on the uninterrupted path, the mind is free from those afflictions, and the dharmic knowledge of true suffering is attained. Again, the door is shut in that very next moment when you have the path of release, the liberated path. And he says then, as soon as this knowledge arises, the remaining three dharmic knowledges also arise, because the afflictions in relation to the Four Noble Truths are abandoned simultaneously. So again, it's just referring to, once more, that continued meditation on emptiness that is now together with the true cessation. The true cessation of any of the intellectually acquired obstructions with relation to the Four Noble Truths. And then, of course, as we're going to see in a moment, with relation to the four subjective awarenesses that know the emptiness of the Four Noble Truths. So then the four subsequent knowledges, the last four of those 8 knowledges that are on the liberated path, are so called because they are minds that indirectly realize themselves, once more, very similar to what we saw in the subsequent forbearances. They realize themselves, the 4 dharmic knowledges, and then I inserted in here, and know their emptinesses. Because the notes from Geshe Jumpa Tech Chuck that I had didn't really have that in there, but obviously they're knowing the emptinesses of them. They're not knowing those minds that realize emptiness. They're knowing the emptiness of the minds that realize emptiness. And they arise at the same time as the 4 dharmic knowledges. So again, the only differentiation between the forbearances and the knowledges is what's occurred by virtue of the forbearances, that you have ceased the portion of the afflictions that are related to those objects that are, in this case, the artificial ones, the intellectually acquired ones. And so, in a sense, you've got those cessations that are together with the knowledges, the dharmic knowledges and the subsequent knowledges. So the presentation of the 8 parts to the uninterrupted path and the 8 parts to the path of release details phenomena qualified by emptiness, which, as I said earlier, a yogi or yogini might take as objects of meditation on the paths of accumulation and preparation. And the simultaneous functioning of the 8 indicates the great power of direct realization of emptiness, which I also mentioned earlier. In that single moment of the uninterrupted path, you're able to abandon all these misconceptions with relation to the Four Noble Truths, and the awareness is realizing the emptiness of the Four Noble Truths. So again, all those acquired conceptions are completely removed, and in the liberated path, they are now gone, so that they won't occur again. The door again has been closed. So for the Hinayana schools, that's the Vaibhashika and the Sautrantika. Those of you who are studying tenets with Venerable George now, would be seeing those schools because they're at the beginning of the presentation of tenets. But we've gone through these on many other classes I've taught for all of you. So for those Hinayana schools, it is possible to ascend these 16 steps one by one. So that's again why they are called subsequent, is because you actually go through the 8 that are the 8 knowledges, the first 4 forbearances, the first 4 forbearances in regard to the Four Noble Truths, then the 4 subsequent forbearances in regard to the wisdom consciousness realizing the emptiness of the Four Noble Truths. And then you would go on to the liberated path and have the same. They would appear sequentially. The Prasangikas, on the other hand, assert that the path of seeing is necessarily limited to this 2-step simultaneous procedure, because a consciousness directly cognizing emptiness necessarily realizes the emptiness of all objects of knowledge, all phenomena. And thus, it is not necessary to pass from one to the other among the various phenomena qualified by emptiness. You don't need to say, okay, now I'm realizing it with regard to true sufferings, and now with regard to true origins, and so on. Or the consciousness is realizing the emptiness of those. You are realizing the emptiness of all phenomena simultaneously. Pretty outrageous, again, when you think about it. In one meditative sitting, a yogi passes from the 4th and last level of the path of preparation, which again we saw previously, it's called supreme mundane qualities, through the uninterrupted path and path of release of the path of seeing. This is in one cushion, the yogi or yogini sitting in meditation and going from that conceptual awareness that's on the path of preparation into a non-conceptual direct realization of emptiness on the uninterrupted path of the path of seeing, and then the path of release that occurs immediately afterwards once the antidote to those acquired conceptions is generated, and then you have the cessation that occurs on the path of release. Liberated path. Now, when that meditator rises from meditative equipoise, they have a consciousness called subsequent attainment. Remember, I talked about that last week. That was another one of the terminology that I went through at the beginning, that is influenced by the previous direct realization of emptiness. Although phenomena appear to be inherently existent to that bodhisattva, like a magician viewing their own creations, they know that all phenomena are empty of inherent existence. They don't believe in that false appearance. Remember, that appearance is there because of the knowledge obstructions that we haven't even touched on yet, because they get removed at the tail end of the path of meditation. We're still on the path of seeing, and all that's being removed, though it's a big chunk, is the artificial, the intellectually acquired afflictive obstructions. We have to go on then to remove the innate afflictive obstructions, and then eventually to remove the knowledge obstructions. For the bodhisattva who comes out of meditative equipoise, even though they've had this profound realization, that false appearance is still there. So they're like a magician who's conjured up a creation of like a horse and an elephant in front of an audience. And they know that it's just something they conjured up. They know it doesn't exist in the way that it's appearing. Or like somebody who's lucidly dreaming, who knows that all the things that are appearing in that dream are not real in the way that our real waking life is. Rather, they are dream objects that don't have any reality. So later, when the bodhisattva forgets their direct realization, that's kind of a strange phrase. And when I saw this, I wasn't sure I wanted to share it because I'm not sure I can explain exactly what that means. The bodhisattva then has a distracted subsequent attainment. I guess they would mean that, again, you do have some level of that sort of wearing off to some degree, because the freshness of that realization when you immediately come out of meditation would be so vivid. But you obviously don't forget that you realized emptiness. You don't forget that things are illusory, that they're appearing to exist in a way that is contradictory to how they actually exist. So again, it's not that they completely forget, but nonetheless, he calls this a distracted subsequent attainment, which I actually never heard this phrase before. If I did, it didn't stick with me because I didn't really think much of it. But the idea is that the bodhisattva doesn't have kind of the immediate effect of that realization for that long, but it is obviously something that sticks with them and that carries forward into how they relate to things. So then, they're actually, yeah, let me go ahead and go through this part, because again, I want to go through the text kind of in one fell swoop, so we can get through most of that. So the bodhisattva's other meditative consciousnesses, Jeffrey Hopkins says, such as those of compassion, of the realization of impermanence, are paths of seeing because they are in the continuum of that bodhisattva. But they are neither paths of seeing as meditative equipoise, nor paths of seeing as subsequent attainment. They are a third category, which is neither. It's kind of interesting that our text doesn't really distinguish them that way, but yet this is true in other presentations. I am finding that there are discrepancies between presentations in Jeffrey Hopkins, for example, Geshe Kelsang Wamo, her presentation, as well as the text that we have. Sometimes things are a little different, even though they're all meant to be an explanation of Prasangika Madhyamaka. But just know that this is, again, a way that you could delineate something else that in our text is really included in subsequent attainment, as you'll see when we go through that. Okay, so let's stop here. And let's go through the text. We aren't going to be able to get too far in the text because of the time, because we do want to take our little break at the beginning. But let's go into the text on page 15. Again, this is where we only did the very beginning of this before I went into my whole little diatribe on the path of seeing and what happens there. We looked at the definition of a Mahayana path of seeing, and we talked last week about why it's a clear Mahayana clear realizer of the truth, because it is that initial direct realization of the truth of reality, emptiness. When these are divided, Mahayana paths of seeing, there are the two. As I said, we don't get this divided into three, as Jeffrey Hopkins was suggesting. The first one is the exalted wisdoms of meditative equipoise, and then we have the exalted wisdoms of subsequent attainment. And then again, Jeffrey Hopkins says you would have a third, which is neither of those. But again, some presentations have that. Ours doesn't. So it's including the things that Jeffrey Hopkins mentioned, which were like the meditation on compassion and so on in the mind of that Bodhisattva. They are included in the subsequent attainment, as you will see. Okay, so let's go into the first of these two divisions. The definition of an exalted wisdom of meditative equipoise of a Mahayana path of seeing is a Mahayana clear realizer of the truth. That's the Mahayana path of seeing, right? That's the same repetition of the definition above, for which dualistic appearance have vanished, or has vanished. All dualistic appearances have vanished. In the face of that meditative equipoise, emptiness is what is appearing. There is no dualistic appearance of subject and object, no appearance of inherent existence. This is what's going on for that bodhisattva. That's how a meditative equipoise of the path of seeing is defined. And all meditative equipoises are consciousnesses to which dualistic appearances have vanished. So, with respect to exalted wisdoms of meditative equipoise of a Mahayana path of seeing, there are three: the uninterrupted paths of a Mahayana path of seeing, the liberated paths of a Mahayana path of seeing, and exalted wisdoms of meditative equipoise of a Mahayana path of seeing, which are neither of those two. So again, I did notice that Geshe Kelsang Wangmo, in her presentation that many of you have, that you probably have printed out or at least have the file, she doesn't include that third category, I believe. That third category is kind of unique to our text, but it makes sense. And we'll go through what that is in a moment. Let's go into each of these three. As it says about the middle of the screen, the definition of an uninterrupted path of a Mahayana path of seeing is that which is an exalted wisdom of meditative equipoise of a Mahayana path of seeing. In other words, just saying it's in the category of an exalted wisdom of meditative equipoise. But what delineates it as different from the next one, the liberated path, is that number two, it's an actual antidote to the artificial conception of true existence, which again is what is abandoned on the path of seeing. So that's what delineates an uninterrupted path, because otherwise, between an uninterrupted path and a liberated path, there's really no difference in the awareness of emptiness, right? Because they're both consciousnesses for which dualistic appearance has vanished. They are both realizing emptiness directly. But what distinguishes the uninterrupted path is it's the actual antidote in this case, the artificial conception of true existence, because that is what is abandoned by the Mahayana path of seeing. When uninterrupted paths of a Mahayana path of seeing are further divided, here they are, the 8 forbearances of a Mahayana path of seeing, hence my explanation for that one little reference. Those 8 also are, synonymous is a weird word to give because they're not really synonymous because they have different objects, but nonetheless, they're all synonymous in the sense of all being emptinesses, and they are also all simultaneous. So essentially they are, I think the intention was that it's more that they're simultaneous with each other, that they are occurring at the same time, as I explained earlier tonight. Okay, so those are the 8 divisions of the uninterrupted path of the path of seeing, which is part of the meditative equipoise of the path of seeing. And so that is, again, that first part where you are generating the wisdom realizing emptiness that is the antidote to the intellectually acquired afflictive obstructions, the conceptions of inherent existence that you've acquired in this life. Now we go on to the second of the 3 meditative equipoises of a path of seeing. This is a liberated path of a Mahayana path of seeing. So the definition is going to look similar in the first part, right? That which is an exalted wisdom of meditative equipoise of a Mahayana path of seeing, which we defined earlier, right? And 2, what distinguishes it is it's distinguished by having abandoned the artificial conception of true existence. In other words, it has that true cessation. So again, I think hopefully my explanation last week and then tonight before getting into this, we're quite clear about what these mean, this terminology. When liberated paths of a Mahayana path of seeing, guess what? There are 8 divisions of that as well. The 8 knowledges of the Mahayana path of seeing, the 8 Dharmic knowledges and the 4 Dharmic knowledges and the 4 subsequent knowledges. These also are produced simultaneously. That's where I think up above it meant by synonymous, they meant simultaneous, because it says these also are produced simultaneously. Again, none of this is new. All of this you should have seen before, and that's why I went through that whole explanation, is so that when we go through the text, I don't have to explain it all over again. So then we have the third category, exalted wisdoms of meditative equipoise of the Mahayana path of seeing, which are neither of those two. Okay, so what's included in that? For instance, the exalted wisdoms of meditative equipoise of the Mahayana path of seeing of someone who has had prior realization of a fundamental vehicle foe destroyer. So this is, again, we're generally talking in this text about those who are newly entering the Bodhisattva path. But occasionally these people are used as an example of where you would have an exception. Because if you have a fundamental vehicle, a Hinayana foe destroyer, they've completed their path, they've already abandoned all the afflictive obstructions, but yet they will progress by way of a meditative equipoise, but it doesn't act as an uninterrupted path to combat the artificial conceptions of inherent existence. Why? Because they were already removed on the fundamental vehicle path when they became, when they entered their path of meditation, and then they removed all the rest of the afflictive obstructions when they became a destroyer, a foe destroyer. So the reason for this, he says, is when a hearer or solitary realizer, foe destroyer, enters the Mahayana path, they already abandoned the conception of true existence while in the fundamental vehicle. That's what brought them to the result of arhat, or foe destroyer, somebody who has completely abandoned those. Then our text goes on to say, since in order to abandon the obstructions to omniscience, the knowledge obstructions, and complete the Mahayana path, they must accumulate the collection of merit for 2 countless eons initially, at the time of the paths of accumulation and preparation. This person trains chiefly in the collection of merit. That's because they don't have to collect wisdom so much, because they already generated the wisdom realizing emptiness on the Hinayana path. So what they're doing mostly is they're generating merit on the paths of accumulation and preparation. Then, since they have already abandoned the afflictive obstructions to omniscience, which are their objects of abandonment over the, this is a mistake in the text. It shouldn't say afflictive obstructions to omniscience. It should say they've already abandoned the afflictive obstructions, which are their objects of abandonment over the 7 impure grounds of the Bodhisattva's path. They also train mainly in the collection of merit there, accumulating the other countless eon of merit. So again, what they're doing is these, let me actually pull up this chart. These people who have completed the Hinayana path, they have to generate, when they're brought out of their state of solitary peace that they abided in for who knows how long, they're brought into the Mahayana, and they have to cultivate effortless bodhicitta over here on the left in order to enter. They, up at the top, you see that they have to start off with 1 great countless eon of merit to get to the path of seeing. But they won't, have this direct realization of emptiness that occurs here that acts as an antidote to the afflictive obstructions that are acquired, because they already abandoned them on the Hinayana path. But they still need to move onto this path to accumulate the 2nd great countless eon in order to get to the 8th ground, which is the demarcation when they actually are renewing a meditative equipoise that acts as an uninterrupted path, because at this point they will start abandoning the knowledge obstructions. So they will follow the Bodhisattva in terms of they will do the same thing the Bodhisattva is doing on the pure grounds here, these last 3 grounds. They will accumulate their 3rd great countless eon of merit, and they will abandon the knowledge obstructions, those subtler stains in the mind. But all the way up to the 7th ground, all they're doing mostly is accumulating merit, because they've already removed the afflictive obstructions in their entirety when they completed the Hinayana path. Okay, so hopefully that's clear. We'll see if there are some breaks when we come back. Whoops, pulled up the wrong tab here. All right, so where was I at then? Okay, so then it says, moreover, it is said that for the sake of empowering the collection of exalted wisdom and meditative equipoise, such a foe destroyer sets in one-pointed equipoise on emptiness, but the verbal conventions of uninterrupted path and liberated path are not used for this meditative equipoise. So as I said, they do have to go into a meditative equipoise on emptiness, but they're not generating an uninterrupted path or therefore a liberated path that follows. Why? Because when they move from the path of preparation to the path of seeing, it's based on merit. They can't be removing anything from the mind because they've already removed the afflictive obstructions. Such a meditative equipoise is neither an uninterrupted path nor a liberated path. Okay, so let's stop there. Take our little break because that was a heck of a lot of words. And when we come back, I'll first see if there are any questions on that because that was a rather lengthy bit to go through there in terms of our text. But all right, so let's take 10 minutes or so. So let's say at 13 minutes after, since I have 2 minutes after now, and make sure that you get 10 minutes. All right, I'll see you all shortly. Okay, so there is a question in the chat box from Doris. Could I elaborate on indirectly realize themselves, which was in Geshe Jampa Tekchog's talking about the subsequent knowledges and forbearances, that there's this indirect realization. I don't know, it's his, I didn't see that, of course, in Jeffrey Hopkins stuff that I shared, but I think what it's meant to be emphasizing, and this is something that if you are studying the tenets class with Venerable George, or if you do that in the future, some of the schools posit that there is this awareness that's called a self-cognizer, which is sort of a direct awareness of consciousness, as if there's like another layer of consciousness observing consciousness. And why it's posited by some of these lower schools is because they say that you have to have that direct awareness. Otherwise, how could you remember the subjective awareness realizing the object? Because after something happens, like say if I asked you to think about, I don't know, something, the first thing you did this morning, whatever it was, you can remember that doing that, whatever the task was, of doing your morning practice or making your coffee or whatever it was. But there's also an awareness of, or remembrance of the awareness that was there present when that was happening. Now, of course, in the Prasangika Madhyamaka, they don't adhere to this idea of direct self-cognizers, because they don't say that the consciousness needs to be have some another layer of awareness that is validating it for the memory and what have you, that the memory of it arises through the sheer experience, the experience of the subjective awareness and the object that's being known. And that's strong enough, in a sense, to imprint the awareness so that you can remember things. So I think that that's part of why he's saying indirectly realize, but it's strange even to say that it's realizing in any way, indirectly or directly, because once more, to that mind that is in meditative equipoise on emptiness, there is no cognizance of anything other than emptiness. Or again, when that second moment in the liberated path, there is an awareness of cessation. But recall last week I mentioned that cessation in Prasangika Madhyamaka is included in ultimate truths. Is it an emptiness? There's a whole debate on that. I don't know if I want to go down that alley, but essentially there is some recognition that what is appearing at that moment has to be ultimate truth. It cannot be conventionalities. So regardless of what is going on in that meditative equipoise, there isn't really the awareness of the objects, which are the Four Noble Truths, nor is there an indirect realization of the awarenesses realizing the emptiness of those objects, because none of those are appearing to that mind in meditative equipoise. That's why, once more, when we go through that whole litany of things, we say, no eye, no ear, no nose, no tongue, because in emptiness, none of those things exist. They don't appear. The only thing that appears is emptiness. So I can't say much more about it, because essentially everything is sort of there indirectly, in a sense, because all those objects that we are realizing the emptiness of, those aren't appearing. But we are realizing nonetheless, as Jeffrey Hopkins pointed out, the emptiness of all phenomena. But the phenomena that have that emptiness as their quality, we aren't realizing those objects, because those objects are all conventional truths. So I'm not sure if I can elaborate more than that. But like I said, I think part of it has to do with this idea of making sure that he doesn't set out any of this idea that there would be a sort of self-cognition of that awareness. Rather, it's sort of indirectly held within the sphere of that in a non-manifest way, where we're not realizing any of those objects that are the basis of emptiness. We're only realizing emptiness. But we could say all of that is there indirectly in a sense. But it is a strange wording. I wouldn't have chosen it myself. I shared it because it was in Geshe Jumpa Tekchok's teachings that were transcribed. These are teachings from Nalanda Monastery many, many years ago when he was the abbot there, that my friend Venerable Tupten Gyatso shared with me when I was at one of the Light of the Path retreats. He had a whole bunch of teachings from Geshe Jumpa Tekchok, and I managed to find a passage that I thought was really quite relevant to what we were talking about tonight, but nonetheless, it does have that one kind of sticky point. So let's see, are there any other questions on what I've talked about tonight, including like these three meditative equipoises that we're talking about? Again, uninterrupted path, path of release, and that which is neither. Stephen, I think you had your hand up. Yeah.
Oh, thank you for taking my question, Don.
Oh, sure.
We learned that on the path of seeing, the interrupted path, that's where
Uninterrupted.
I'm sorry,
Yeah.
the uninterrupted path.
Mm-hmm.
That's where we abandon all of the acquired afflictions.
Mm-hmm.
But we just talk about the 8 forbearances there. So is it just realizing the emptiness of those 8 forbearances that allows us to abandon all the other afflictive obstructions, or is something else going on?
Okay, so again, the way that I think it was worded with Jeffrey Hopkins was saying that we're removing the artificial or the acquired conceptions of
Yeah,
inherent
acquired.
existence
Yes. Yeah.
with respect to the Four Noble Truths and the four awarenesses realizing the emptiness of the Four Noble Truths. So they would be only the intellectually acquired level of those. All of the innate are going to be removed through a meditation on emptiness that follows on the path of meditation, and they don't involve these knowledges and forbearances, because that's only used when we talk about that initial direct realization of emptiness. Because even though the emptiness of all those objects are being realized, because the emptiness of everything is being realized, we don't really remove the misconceptions of inherent existence with regard to them completely, because those are removed in stages, beginning with the artificial, the acquired, the intellectually acquired. So does that answer your question, or was there something more
Um,
that I missed?
I must have misspoke. So I am asking about the acquired or
Mhm.
the acquired obstructions. But when we talk about that, we only talk about the 8 forbearances, the realization of those 8 forbearances. So does that realization of the emptiness of those 8 forbearances, does that serve to help us abandon or cause the abandonment of all um, all acquired obstructions, no matter what they are?
All acquired obstructions. We're talking about, again, the acquired afflictive obstructions, which
Yeah,
are,
that's right. So anything that we might learn
Mhm.
from false teachings or mistaken views and so
Mm,
on.
mhm.
So we're not like um, in that uninterrupted path. We're not abandoning those individual false views. We're just simply realizing the emptiness of the four truths and the mind that realizes those, and that in
Yeah.
turn serves to dispel all of those
Well,
acquired.
yeah. I mean, but technically there is another, I mean, we could say there's more that's abandoned on the path of seeing, because, for example, there are not just the acquired views of a inherently existent self that are often called the views of the transitory collection, but there
Right.
are also two other, these are often called the three thorough entanglements. These are kind of three things that we say would definitely be dispelled, eliminated by virtue of seeing the truth, realizing the truth directly the first time. Besides those acquired misconceptions, we would also have any view that about a path that is not a correct path to realizing liberation and enlightenment. In the course that you were in on mental factors, minds and mental factors, that when I finished about a year ago or something, I don't remember when I finished it. Everything's kind of a blur with the
Yeah.
pandemic, but there are 5 different afflicted views. One of them is the view of the transitory collection, that again, here we're removing the acquired level of that. But one of them is called a view that is conceiving of bad morality and modes of conduct as supreme. Like
Right.
that somebody would think that engaging in ascetic practices and
Animal
various things,
sacrifice. Yeah. Yeah.
would lead to liberation. And of course, one knows by virtue of seeing the truth directly that those views are all hogwash, that you cannot achieve liberation through them. You can only achieve liberation through the path that you've just realized that you are setting out to, continue on the path of meditation. So that one is one of the thorough entanglements that's removed. The other one is afflicted doubt, which is one of the 6 root afflictions. Besides afflicted views, ignorance, attachment, anger, and pride, that is also removed. You no longer have any doubt about any of the teachings of the Buddha because you've seen the truth of emptiness and have complete conviction in those. So anything that is an afflicted form of doubt, which is a sort of two-pointedness of mind that can't proceed, then you would have removed that as well. These 3 thorough entanglements are often talked about as the first one, that strong adherence to an inherently existent self. It's comparable to like a journey you're going to take. And in the first one, you're not even wanting to go because you're quite happy clinging to this false sense of an I. The second one is that you're confused about the way to go, the path that will lead you there. And that's if you think, again, bad morality, modes of conduct are supreme, or the way that you actually get there. The third one is having a doubt about which way to go. And of course, that's the afflicted doubts that we have on the path. So there are more things that we can say are removed that are other conceptions that will not arise in the mind again because of seeing truth directly for the first time. But usually they're not included necessarily. Well, I guess they are part of what we would call the objects of abandonment that are, left behind on the path with the path of seeing. But here we're primarily focusing on the afflictive obstructions in particular. Um,
Mhm.
I mean, again, even probably those two, though, when we look at them, I mean, doubt and these holding bad modes of conduct as supreme, those would be acquired in this life. I don't know that you can carry over. Maybe you've got some seeds of doubt in your mind, but you are generally acquiring those through your false thinking in this life. And things you've been exposed to, people telling you, oh, in order to achieve liberation, you have to walk across hot coals or do some silly, thing, or burn your body, whatever. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think it does.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you,
Sorry,
Don.
I misunderstood the first time, but yeah. But we're mostly talking about, again, what we've acquired in this life, which again could include some of these other conceptions. But that's what comes to mind to me from my studies, is the 3 thorough entanglements we also say again are removed at that level. And there's probably some other things that are removed, but I'd have to go back to my other studies to refresh my memory. Doris, I think you had a question too. Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, maybe. Yeah. Go ahead, Doris. We need you to unmute. Yeah. Great.
Well, I was going to duck it. It wasn't a question. It was just that my question earlier connected to my question last week which was, what is the awareness at the moment of the realization of emptiness? And I felt a contradiction.
Okay. And again, the awareness at that time is this mind that is immersed in emptiness with no other objects appearing. And so, again, it does sound contradictory. I agree with you. And hopefully my explanation made it a little clearer, because we can say again that all those other things are I mean, if we're realizing the emptiness of all phenomena, the phenomena that have that emptiness as a characteristic aren't appearing, but we can say that they're sort of there indirectly. But I still don't even like, again, like I said, I wouldn't have chosen Geshe Japa Tekshok's description of that, because I don't know that it's again, I would hope that what he was doing was really just emphasizing that there's no direct self-cognition that's going on at that point. That is an awareness of the awareness realizing emptiness. And I think he's trying to say that isn't happening. It's rather a sort of indirect object that is realized to be empty of inherent existence. The wisdom consciousness realizing the emptiness of the Four Noble Truths, it itself is being realized as empty of inherent existence. But it's all emptiness all the way down. So all emptiness in terms of the object that's appearing at that time. So thank you, Doris. Yeah, any other questions or comments? Okay, let's dig back in. See, we'll finish off the path of seeing. We only have a little bit left to the path of seeing, and then we can get on to the path of meditation, which has a lot of similar concepts, so I don't need to explain quite as much. But in the sort of middle, top, just above, it says second. This is the second division that this text sets out. Remember, Jeffrey Hopkins said there's a third division, which is that which is neither meditative equipoise or subsequent attainment. But here, the definition of an exalted wisdom of subsequent attainment of a Mahayana path of seeing is a Mahayana clear realizer of the truth. Why? Because that's the path of seeing, which does not realize emptiness directly. Again, the realization of emptiness will be in the continuum of that being who is on the path of seeing in subsequent attainment, but it's not appearing directly. So then it says, when exalted wisdom of subsequent attainment of a Mahayana path of seeing are divided, there are two exalted wisdoms of subsequent attainment of Mahayana paths of seeing, which abide as method types of realizers, and exalted wisdoms of subsequent attainment of Mahayana paths of seeing, which abide as wisdom types of realizers. Remember, these are the two wings of the bird, the two aspects of the path. Method includes all the various things. As it says here, the first in the method types of realizers is, for instance, an altruistic mind generation, bodhicitta, which is a pure, unusual attitude in the continuum of a first ground bodhisattva. And we would include in there, I would assume, Jeffrey Hopkins again included it as a third category, but I think you would include in there realizations of impermanence, realizations of compassion, anything else the bodhisattva is meditating on, and other minds that are being generated when they're not in direct realization of emptiness. The second, which has to do with the wisdom types of realizers, is, for instance, an exalted wisdom in the continuum of such a person which directly realizes conventional truths. This one I don't know if I can explain quite so well, because again, directly realizing conventional truths, I'm not sure, except again in Prasangika and Niyamika, I think they do talk about how a direct realization is when one is seeing subsequent, kind of the understanding of something, but on the basis of one's realization of emptiness, we again aren't realizing emptiness necessarily, because it says it's realizing conventional truths, but yet I think we are seeing those truths in a correct manner due to the influence of our wisdom realizing emptiness. So, for example, as we all know, the mode of abiding of all phenomena when it comes to their conventional existence is that they are dependent arisings. They are arising on the basis of imputation, mere imputation, nothing more than imputation. So that isn't what is realized by ultimate truth, right? Ultimate truth is realizing the emptiness, the lack of independent existence. But to realize their dependent existence is realizing conventional truths. And it's realizing it informed by our wisdom, right? Because the bodhisattva, when they've come out of that realization that there's no independent existence, will see things correctly through the lens of knowing that they therefore exist dependently. Independence upon their causes and conditions, their parts, but at the subtlest level, independence upon mere designation, mere imputation. So that's my interpretation of that. Again, I haven't been able to, listen to all of Venerable Thupten Chodron's teachings on this, because there's just so many of them, and I'd have to really search out that one to see how she commented on that particular sentence. But my understanding is that would be, again, it's not a wisdom directly realizing emptiness, but it's a wisdom knowing conventionalities in the way that they actually exist, is as mere imputation, mere designations. So, okay, I'll see if I can find out anything more about that, but I didn't really have time to do that today. So, All right, so we are moving on then to the second of the superior grounds. The superior grounds, again, being the Bodhisattva who is an Arya, who has seen emptiness directly. Again, if they've entered the Mahayana from having completed the Hinayana, the fundamental vehicle, they would already have that realization. But here we're talking about somebody who newly, freshly enters the Mahayana path. So they are going into it from that vantage point. Oh, I do have a few other things on the path of seeing. Sorry, I forgot I had a few slides for that. So a few more things we could say about the path of seeing. The following are all attained simultaneously with the initial moment of the Bodhisattva's direct realization of emptiness. Of course, you attain the Mahayana path of seeing. That's your first moment of that. It's also the attainment of the first Bodhisattva ground, the very joyful. We'll go into the grounds a bit more as we get into the path of meditation, but especially when we do a discussion of the individual grounds. 3, the state of an Arya or superior Bodhisattva. You aren't an Arya Bodhisattva prior to that. Again, this is all for the Bodhisattva who's newly entering the Mahayana. You become an Arya or a superior. You gain that title in a sense because of the exalted wisdom directly realizing emptiness in your continuum. You also have the first moment of what's called ultimate bodhicitta. Ultimate bodhicitta is the realization of emptiness in the mind of someone who's conjoined with conventional bodhicitta, who has that as the support for doing that. So I think I even have a little bit more on that. Ultimate bodhicitta refers to a meditative equipoise directly realizing emptiness in the continuum of an Arya bodhisattva. In other words, a Mahayanist on the path of seeing, path of meditation, or the path of no more learning, because that's the only grounds or paths where a bodhisattva who's directly realized emptiness exists. You're only an Arya bodhisattva after you go through those 3 paths. Now, it's kind of interesting. You know, this was taken from, I think I took these notes from Geshe Kelsang Wanmo, but technically you aren't an Arya bodhisattva when you're on the path of no more learning. You're an Arya Buddha. So I don't know if we can, maybe it would have to be corrected to be, you know, defendable in a debate, because somebody could debate there are no Arya Bodhisattvas on the path of no more learning, and that is true. You only have Arya Buddhas at that point, because Bodhisattva is only a being who strives to become enlightened. Once you become enlightened, you're a Buddha. But anyway, that's a little thing I noticed in going through this, but I didn't make any correction because, again, these are using some of the information from her notes, but I think I'm correct in what I'm saying there. Ultimate bodhicitta, second bullet point, is not actual bodhicitta, for it is not a mind that is concomitant with the aspiration for enlightenment. Actual bodhicitta is equivalent to conventional bodhicitta. So again, it's not a realization of the aspiration to become a Buddha for the sake of others. It's a realization of emptiness. It just happens to be in the continuum of an Arya Bodhisattva, of a Bodhisattva who has this conventional bodhicitta. From the Mahayana path of seeing onwards, all paths that do not directly realize emptiness are conjoined with ultimate bodhicitta. So whatever paths that we're generating, whatever awarenesses, consciousnesses, meditating on compassion, bodhicitta, what have you, they are conjoined with ultimate bodhicitta, which means that it's in the continuum of that being, but it is not manifest at that time. So again, only the direct realizations of emptiness are considered to be ultimate bodhicitta, but all paths that don't realize emptiness would be conjoined with it. This means that even when the meditative equipoise directly realizing emptiness in the continuum of an Arya Bodhisattva lies dormant, it affects other paths such as conventional bodhicitta, great compassion, the practice of the perfection of generosity, and so on, by enhancing their capacity and strength. Why? Because it's seeing things more correctly. It's working within the understanding of emptiness. Remember, Rinpoche is always encouraging us to practice the emptiness of the 3 spheres with all the activities that we do. Well, the Bodhisattva, who has the direct realization of emptiness, can practice that to an even greater degree, and thereby make their actions even more meritorious because they're uniting, in a sense, wisdom and compassion, wisdom and method. Then, also from the Mahayana path of seeing onwards, the Bodhisattva no longer accumulates projecting karma for rebirth in samsara. right? Because you'd have to have that ignorance being manifest, and that ignorance can't be manifest because you have seen truth. You know that things are existing in a way that's different than how they appear. You have complete reinforcement for, only seeing things as they are, as opposed to projecting inherent existence on them. So the belief in all of that, again, would be completely undermined. So you would never have the ignorance that is creating karma for rebirth in samsara. It's just not happening because it's been disempowered. You haven't removed that ignorance and all of its seeds from your continuum, but you no longer create actions that are motivated by it, that are driven by it. Maybe motivated isn't quite the right word, that are together with it, coming out of a view of things as inherently existent and ignorance. From this point on as well, the Bodhisattva will no longer be born uncontrollably through the power of afflictions and projecting karma. And that's, again, karma that was attained prior to the path of seeing. They can accumulate projecting karma that is uncontaminated and what have you, but this is all the stuff that they've accumulated before. So they won't create any new projecting karma that's under the power of the afflictions, but they will have that they created prior to the path of seeing. And they won't take rebirth through the force of that, though. Rather, in a deliberate manner, as it says here, through the power of compassion and prayer, in order to benefit sentient beings. So that's how they take rebirth, is they are born through the power of their compassion, not through the power of the contaminated karma they created prior to the path of seeing. Okay, so finally, I think this is the last point. This is having to do with the first ground, the bodhicitta that is on the first ground, the conventional bodhicitta, and on the path of seeing, as well as throughout the first ground, which actually ends in the path of meditation. It's called treasure-like bodhicitta. Why? Because the first ground is characterized by bodhisattvas specifically focusing on the practice of the perfection of generosity. So I have some quotes here from Geshe Jampa Gyatso, my teacher in Italy, when he taught on these grounds as part of the Abhisamayalankara. It says here, the mind generation or bodhicitta associated with generosity, that's the subject, is like a great treasure, that's the predicate. Why? Because it satisfies all sentient beings with wealth and resources. So in Sutra it says, desiring to establish the miserly and so forth in generosity. So we're going to see this coming up when we get into the other grounds and what have you. Generosity is the perfection that is surpassed on the first ground. It's also the first of the 10 perfections, as well as we see it in our studies and practices, the first of the 6 perfections. But the word generosity, Geshe says, comes here because it corresponds with the first ground of the path of seeing, on which a bodhisattva emphasizes the practice of generosity. For this reason, their mind generation is called together with generosity. It is said to be like a great treasure, like a huge treasure house from which all material things or whatever is needed by sentient beings will be generated. That's the power of the bodhisattva's mind of generosity on the path of seeing. All right, so sorry, I forgot that I had those little bits to wrap up the path of seeing. Let's go on to the Mahayana paths of meditation. This is again the second of the divisions of the grounds of bodhisattva superiors. The etymology, it's usually this word gom, gomlam. Gom, as we know, and you've all heard before, I'm sure, is the word that means meditation or familiarize in the Tibetan. It is why we call our meeting space a gompa. Anyway, lam, of course, means path. So this is the path of familiarization or of meditation. So this is a path that continuously meditates on or familiarizes itself with the direct realization of emptiness that was newly achieved on the path of seeing. It's not that that's all that the bodhisattva does, because the bodhisattva has a lot of merit to accumulate too, but it's nonetheless mostly trying to refamiliarize again and again with the meditation on emptiness, so it becomes stronger and stronger through the force of the merit one's accumulating together with it, and eventually it becomes possible to then start working at layer after layer of the obscurations that remain. This is defined, actually the definition is going to come up. So let's go ahead and go to our text and begin going through the text on this. Again, we're on page 16 at the bottom. Let me just scroll a little bit up here. The definition of a Mahayana path of meditation is a Mahayana subsequent clear realizer. Of course, we would also include of the truth in here, but again, clear realization of what the path of seeing realized. It's subsequent to the path of seeing and continues to realize the same truth. When Mahayana paths of meditation are divided, there are two: exalted wisdoms of meditative equipoise and exalted wisdoms of subsequent attainment of the Mahayana paths of meditation. Again, divisions very similar to the path of seeing, right? Definition of an exalted wisdom of meditative equipoise of a Mahayana path of meditation is a Mahayana subsequent clear realizer. That's repeating the definition from above. That's what makes it a Mahayana path of meditation. Why is it meditative equipoise? Because it's one for which dualistic appearances with respect to emptiness have vanished, just like we saw with the path of seeing, the meditative equipoise there. So again, no great shakes with all of this. When these are divided, there are three: uninterrupted paths of Mahayana paths of meditation, liberated paths of Mahayana paths of meditation, and exalted wisdoms of meditative equipoise of Mahayana paths of meditation, which are neither of those two. Again, very similar, than what we saw before, and that's why I'm going to go through this up to a point, and then I'm going to have to go to the slides because I need to give you a little more information to work with for the remainder of it. So the first of those three, an uninterrupted path of a Mahayana path of meditation, is that which is an exalted wisdom of meditative equipoise of a Mahayana path of meditation, similar to what we saw in the definition for that of the Mahayana path of seeing, which too serves as an actual antidote to whichever of the two types of obstructions it is its corresponding object of abandonment. Recall what we have to remove yet. All we've removed when we come into the path of meditation, prior to that, realization that takes us into the path of meditation, is the acquired afflictive obstruction. So we still have to remove all of the innate, and we also have to remove the knowledge obstructions. So whichever is the corresponding object of abandonment, the level of those that it is an antidote towards, that is the definition of an uninterrupted path. It acts as an actual antidote to whichever of those levels is being abandoned at that time. So when uninterrupted paths of a Mahayana path of meditation are divided, there are two: that which actually abandon the innate afflictive obstructions, and that which actually abandons the obstructions with regard to the objects of knowledge, the knowledge obstructions. Okay, so I think this is where I need to kind of take a little break from the text and go back to the slides, because otherwise we're going to get into a whole bunch of stuff here that I think is better explained through what I've got in the slides than what I have in the text. Okay, so I got to realize I got a few typos in this tonight. The Bodhisattva on this path, the path of meditation, repeatedly settles into a meditative equipoise that directly realizes emptiness, as we saw earlier. This is so because the meditative equipoise paths on the path of meditation serve as direct antidotes to either the innate afflictive obstructions or the knowledge obstructions. By the way, knowledge obstructions are not divided into innate and acquired because they're all innate. They're all inborn. They're all what we've had since beginningless time. Every time we have a conception of inherent existence, it strengthens those imprints, but they are not acquired in that sense of kind of new conceptions that are involved. The knowledge obstructions themselves are not conceptions. They are not consciousnesses. They are once more the imprints from that ignorance, as well as the dualistic appearance that is rising from those imprints. Okay, so in comparison to the intellectually acquired afflictive obstructions, which can be removed in one meditative session on the path of seeing, the innate afflictive obstructions, as well as the knowledge obstructions, are more difficult to eliminate. This is, again, just saying that what we've acquired in this life is relatively easy to remove because we've only acquired it in this life. It's all the superficial stuff that we've layered on top of these deeper ones. But the deeper errors, which are the misconceptions of inherent existence we've had since beginningless time, and the imprints of those that are the knowledge obstructions giving rise to that dualistic appearance, are much more difficult to eliminate. Thus, as it says in the second bullet point, they are removed in stages by first eradicating the coarser types of innate afflictive obstructions and then the subtler ones. That's the first part of it. Get rid of the coarser all the way to the subtler of the innate afflictive obstructions. And then only after attaining the cessation of the subtlest innate afflictive obstructions are bodhisattvas then able to eliminate the coarser and subtler levels of the knowledge obstructions. They too are divided into coarse versus subtle. So we are always going to remove the coarsest first and then the subtlest last, because the subtlest are the most difficult to remove. The knowledge obstructions are subtler than the afflictive obstructions. Therefore, they have to be removed last. And then within each of these, afflictive, innate afflictive, as well as knowledge, there are coarser and subtler levels of each of those. Okay, so through familiarity with meditation on emptiness, as well as through the increase in bodhicitta and the accumulation of merit, especially through engaging in the first four perfections, that excludes concentration and wisdom, because those are the forces through which one actually develops that ability to cut through the next level. But we need the additional merit that we accumulate through generosity, morality, patience, joyous enthusiasm. So it's especially those practices that cause us to accumulate merit. So through the increase of meditation on emptiness, as well as that's the wisdom side, as well as the increase in merit, that's the method side, the power of the uninterrupted paths in the continuum of the bodhisattva on this path of meditation becomes increasingly greater, and thus able to serve as the antidote to increasingly subtler obstructions. It's like the mind becomes stronger through that additional wisdom that is strengthened through familiarity, as well as the method side, which has got greater merit, more gas in the tank, if you will, that allows us to cut through more. So we become stronger and stronger in the power of the uninterrupted path. It's still the same in terms of a direct realization of emptiness, but it has more power to remove subtler and subtler obstructions. So this is comparable, they often say this, to the process of removing stains from cloth, where it does in fact take a lot less energy to remove grosser stains, but more strength to remove the subtler ones. So, whoops, let me stop the screen share for a moment. So like if you had a white t-shirt and you dropped some pasta sauce on it or something, you know that you could probably get rid of like the really red part of it that's quite prominent by just washing it under a sink or something, a hose, and you'd kind of put a little soap and maybe get a little bit of it off. But if you really want to get rid of the imprint of that, in that you're going to have to take, if you're not talking about spraying on something and putting it in the washing machine, if you're really going to try to get it out, it takes greater and greater effort, right? You have to really work at it to get that subtler and subtler stain out. This is the idea behind this, that if you think about that as an analogy, we're doing the same with regard to our minds. We have coarser levels of these things, and we're going to remove those first and then work our way through a more powerful, stronger mind to eventually remove the subtlest stains. And so this is how the process goes. So let's go back to the slides. All right, so given that we have coarse and subtle levels, let's talk about the innate afflictive obstructions. And we're going to divide them into 9 levels. Now, know that there's an additional 9 that we can talk about within these. I'm not going to go to that level of talking about these, because you start corresponding them to the various realms of existence and blah, 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 blah. Just know that there are going to be 3, the first 3 are considered to be big innate afflictive obstructions. There's going to be the big of the big, the middling of the big, and the small of the big. The next 3 are all going to be middling in relation to those that came before that were all big, and those that are going to come after that are all small. But they are also divided into 3. The big of the middling of the middling, and the small of the middling. And then lastly, the small, which are the subtlest of these innate obstructions, afflictive obstructions. They're going to also be divided into the big of the small, the middling of the small, and the subtlest one, which is the small of the small innate afflictive obstructions. Okay, so this is all information necessary for us to go back into the text if we get time to do that yet tonight, or whether we do that next week. I hope not, because I'll have to introduce all of these again, but that's okay. So this is the way we divide up the innate afflictive obstructions. And what we're going to see then is on each of the 2nd through the 8th grounds. We're already on the 1st ground. That's why I included it in the path of seeing when I had it on that slide just a short while ago. We actually enter the 1st ground, the 1st bhumi, when we enter the path of seeing. We're going to enter the 2nd bhumi. We have the last sort of bit of the 1st ground, then go into the 2nd ground, which is all within the path of meditation. All the remaining grounds are within the path of meditation. The 2nd ground is going to serve to remove the first of these 9 levels, the big of the big, innate. The 3rd ground, the middling of the big, innate. The 4th ground, the small of the big, innate. So by the time we get to the 5th ground, we have completely removed all of the big. The 5th ground removes the big of the middling, the 6th, the middling of the middling, the 7th, the small of the middling. So we have sequentially so far, it's just gone right as planned, right? You remove each of those of the 9 levels. When you get to the lower part of the 8th ground, which is when you cultivate that meditative equipoise at the end of the 7th ground that takes you into the 8th ground, you will have removed all of the small, the big of the small, the middling of the small, and the small of the small innate afflictive obstructions. And that's because, once more, the Bodhisattva's mind has become very powerful by then, that it is capable in that one sitting that is a meditative equipoise that takes you into the path, the 8th ground, that you will then have the power to remove all of these subtlest obstructions. So you might wonder, I mean, it does seem a little strange. It takes you each of these progressions through a ground to get rid of each of these other levels. Those are all coarser. Well, why are you able to abandon all these subtler ones all at once? Again, it does have to do with the power of the Bodhisattva's mind at that level. Because they've removed so many of the other obstructions, they also, again, have greater power to their mind. But we'll see this coming up in our explanation later. That's the schema that, again, is my understanding, and Jeffrey Hopkins. There are some slightly different things with regard to the 1st ground in Geshe Kelsang Wanmo's. And know that I've been kind of researching this a little bit as I've done this course. There are some discrepancies, again, I pointed this out earlier, between how certain people present the grounds and paths, even in our tradition. So it doesn't matter as much as we get the kind of general idea of what's happening. We are actually going through a process of removing layer by layer these innate afflictive obstructions till they all are removed when we enter into the 8th ground. When we have that meditative equipoise that takes us into the 8th ground, that acts as an antidote to the last, the small level, both big, or all 3, big, middling, and small of the small innate afflictive obstructions. Okay, so let's talk about knowledge obstructions. They too are divided into levels based on coarseness and subtleness. Here we're going to call them the great, the middling, and the small. And you might think it makes sense, well, then, that we have the great removed on the 8th ground, with the end of the 8th ground going into the 9th. The 9th will remove the middling, and then the 10th will remove the small. And to some degree, that's true, but we need kind of a different process for that a little. Why? Because the last of these, the small knowledge obstructions, are going to be further divided into 2 levels. The coarse of the small knowledge obstructions and the subtle of the small knowledge obstructions, which are the last little impurities in the mind that have to be removed, that are the subtlest of these imprints. Again, don't ask me to describe what the difference is in terms of these. They're just another layer, just kind of reducing it so that it becomes less and less prominent or present, and so that we can eventually get rid of it in its entirety. Okay, so how are they removed? On the 8th through the 10th grounds, a portion of the knowledge obstructions is abandoned. The upper part of the 8th ground, because you actually do have 2 meditative equipoises on the 8th ground, you remove the great knowledge obstructions. On the 9th ground, you remove the middling knowledge obstructions. And on the initial part of the 10th ground, because there are 2 meditative equipoises on the 10th ground, you remove the coarse of the small. On the final part of the 10th ground, when you generate the antidote to these subtlest obscurations, the subtle small knowledge obscurations. That acts as the means by which you cross over into the path of no more learning and you become a Buddha. Again, we'll go into these in more detail when we go through the text, but essentially this is the schema for how we're going to go about abandoning these through the grounds that occur on the path of meditation. Okay. All right, so where are we at time-wise? We only have about 5 minutes left. Okay, so maybe we just have to stop there. Because again, we're going to pick back up next week on page 17 of the text where we go into what actually occurs here. Well, maybe I can actually, I hate to jam it in, but if I just go through these first sentences, they're a way of recapping what we just looked at. So it says here, let me scroll up just a little so it's towards the center of the screen. When uninterrupted paths of Mahayana paths of meditation, which actually abandon the innate afflictive obstructions, are abandoned or are divided, there are 7. Why? Because there are the 6 cycles of innate conceptions of true existence, from the big of the big to the small of the middling. Those are the first 6 that we saw, right? That are actually abandoned, respectively, by the 6 uninterrupted paths of meditation from the 2nd ground to the 7th ground. Then you have 3 more levels that are abandoned in one fell swoop. That's the 7th of these divisions. The cycle of the 3 small innate conceptions of true existence, which are the big of the small, the middling of the small, and the small of the small. They are abandoned simultaneously by one moment of the uninterrupted path of the lower part of the 8th ground. And this is because the statement that when one attains the 8th ground, one is able to abandon in just a short time that which one could not abandon even in 100,000 eons of the 7th ground and below, is suitable to refer to the capacity of one on this ground to abandon in one moment the cycle of the 3 small conceptions of true existence, which are objects of abandonment of the path of meditation. Essentially saying what I said earlier, that you have a great power to that mind on the 8th ground when you enter into the 8th ground that allows you to remove all 3 of these subtler levels simultaneously. The reason for this is that there exist on this ground spontaneous deeds, pacifying coarse striving and exertion. It is like the way in which the progress of a great ship is difficult until reaching the ocean. But having reached the ocean, it can cross each day what would have taken 100 years before reaching it. And there's a sutra quote that follows, but I'll go into that again and repeat that next week when we get together. But this idea of the ocean, they say that like if a ship is on a river or whatever, when it reaches the vastness of the ocean, because there are so many currents, the ship can move much more quickly. I don't know much about sailing. I've never sailed. But apparently on the ocean, you have susceptibility to so many more of these currents that will actually take a boat much further more quickly. So that is actually the idea, is once you cross over into the 8th ground, you have an incredible power to the mind of the Bodhisattva that allows them to remove in that one meditative equipoise all 3 layers of the small innate afflictive obstructions. So we haven't yet seen the presentation in regard to the knowledge obstructions, but this is what's going on the path of meditation initially. And I'll just pull up the chart to show you, just so you're quite aware of that. Know that based on some of this additional information, we might have to modify this chart to include some additional meditative equipoise that's happening on the 8th ground and the 10th ground. I don't know if we were aware of that when the master's program, when this was initially put together, but anyway, it is one small correction that would be made to this. But you see, again, we at the very tail end of the path of seeing, one generates a meditative equipoise that begins the path of meditation. That is technically still on the 1st ground because one hasn't actually abandoned the big of the big innate afflictions. And then one goes on to generate more paths, meditative equipoise, until one generates this one at the end of the 7th ground that causes one then to have the liberated path of the 8th ground, in which one has actually achieved complete removal of all the afflictive obstructions. So it's at this point point H, where someone is equivalent to a foe destroyer and having removed all of those. I also do see some discrepancies in the way Venerable Geshe Kelsang Wangmo presents the uninterrupted paths. Our understanding in the Master's program is that the uninterrupted path always belongs to the previous ground. So that's why here it's the first ground, and then the second ground is where the liberated path is. And then at the end of the second ground is the uninterrupted path that will liberate you into the third ground. But anyway, I have to take a closer look at this chart in the light of these teachings. Because as I said, I've never encountered even a text that taught the Prasangika way of proceeding through the grounds and paths. And Geshe Chönyi, who is the abbot at Kopan Monastery, in some teachings he gave on the Prasangika grounds and paths, he actually said that there are different presentations. And Sarah J. presents it one way, which he thought was in line with this chart, I believe, that I just had on the screen. And then there are other monasteries that will teach it in slightly different ways, because the Buddha never really set out exactly what's going on these things. It's an inference that we have on the basis of various other texts that we can then put together that part of the map in terms of what exactly is happening, what's being removed. But essentially the gist of it is to know that, once more, it's a gradual process. It's not like the Bodhisattva can go simply into one meditative equipoise and remove everything in one fell swoop. Has to continue to accumulate both of those. Again, wisdom through familiarizing with emptiness, and method through generating merit in subsequent attainment, that together cause another layer to be removed, another layer, and so on. Okay, that's enough for tonight. Were there any final questions? Okay, well, if you do have questions, if they come up in thinking about this material or looking at the slides, I'm going to have to do a few little tweaks of the slides for typos and things I saw in there. But essentially, yeah, I'll get those to Mary, and we'll get those posted on the website, the Dropbox page. But all right, let's go ahead and do our dedication prayers then. So again, thinking about everything that we've done here tonight and wanting this to become the cause for the best possible result for all beings, we dedicate in the following way. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. And then recalling bodhicitta and how powerful this mind is, as we're seeing, this is that whole method factor that just keeps everything moving forward all the way to enlightenment. We want this to grow in our own hearts and in the hearts of all beings. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish but increase more and more. Then we do the prayers for our precious teachers. As we recite these, once more, extend this out to include all spiritual guides. The wish-granting, wish-fulfilling jewel, source of every single benefit and happiness in this world, to the incomparably kind Tenzin Gyatso, I beseech, may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. And then for Rinpoche, you who uphold the subduer's moral way, who serve as the bountiful bearer of all, sustaining, preserving, and spreading Manjunath's victorious doctrine, who masterfully accomplish magnificent prayers honoring the three jewels, Savior of myself and others, your disciples, please, please live long. And then for Tenzin Osalhita, Lama Yeshe's reincarnation, Venerable One, to you whose kindness exceeds that of all the conquerors for those wanderers in far-off places, especially the West, mindful of your loving concern for us in intentionally descending again into a family of a far distant land, we make this request. O Lama, please, please live long. Then lastly, dedicate for whoever you're holding in your heart right now. We all have beings who are going through difficult times, who are having obstacles, illness, who are dying or who have died. And so send that merit out to them. Think that they receive it. It removes their suffering immediately and brings them all the causes that will lead them to perfect happiness. And may all beings find true peace and happiness through what we've done here tonight. Wonderful. So before we all go, I do want to just give much gratitude and thanks to Mary for all of the support she's been providing as SPC. As you probably saw in the email, starting April 1st, Shanka and Venerable Dundrup will be kind of helping out with some of the tasks that Mary did. She's done an amazing job. And I think there's at 12:30 on Sunday, a nice little Zoom gathering, people to come and sort of pay respects to Mary. And hopefully when things open up and everything, we can all celebrate much more Mary's amazing accomplishments in the time that she's been there as SPC. But I just want to, on this last night of my teaching with her as SPC, I want to really extend my gratitude to her and amazing things that you've done that everyone has really benefited from. So thank you so much. All right. And thank you everyone for being here tonight. Please stay safe and healthy, and I'll see you again soon. All right. Be well.